everyone. I'm Tim Cooper from the Arc of Alabama, and welcome to Able for All. Today's guest is Jessica Odom from the Arc of Southwest Alabama, and the topic is HCBS standards and the final access rule. So, welcome, and now here's Kim and Mary.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us at Able for All. We're so excited to have you here. We have the pleasure of joining Jessica Odom. She is our Executive Director of the Chatham County ARC, and she's going to be sharing with us all things new and exciting about the Home and Community-Based Settings Rule and the final access rule today. And Mary, our self-advocate, Mary White, the awesome Mary,
yes,
is going to be joining us and talking about how she is able and how we can all be able. And we'll learn a little bit more about advocacy for community-based services through Mary's questions. So we're going to have a nice round of questions. Miss Odom is going to share a great PowerPoint straight from ADMH, and we will take it from there. So Miss Jessica, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Absolutely. So I'm Jessica Odom. I'm the director of the ARC of Southwest Alabama in Chatham. I've been the director for a little over 8 years now. So I've been through the news that there is an access rule. So in May, Alabama Department of Mental Health actually settings rule is like a 300-page Medicaid document. So this is a real brief summary of that rule. So I'm going to go through this, and if you have questions along the way, definitely ask. Otherwise, if you just want to save them for the end, that's okay too, Mary and Kim.
All
Can
right.
y'all still hear me?
We can. It went in and out a little bit, but I think we got you right now. We'll save our questions for the end because we really want to get into the PowerPoint of it.
Okay. So ensuring that Medicaid beneficiaries can access the services is a critical function of the Medicaid program. The Department of Health and Human Services Centers for Medicare and Medicaid established policies with objectives to protect and strengthen Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act and make high-quality health care accessible and affordable for all Americans. The final access rule advances that access across the services. The goals are to strengthen the workforce, increase access to services, monitor ongoing person-centered planning, improvement of health and safety for people receiving services, giving stakeholders like Mary better access to information and a stronger voice in service delivery, and creating federal standards for measuring that quality with appropriate considerations for stratification of key demographics. And it talks about that again in just a minute, about that stratification of measures. So there's 6 broad bullet points, basically, for this final access rule. And it's access and person-centered planning. Of course, person-centered planning is a big focus for Medicaid right now because that was also in the HCBS final settings rule. Grievances, so when you have an issue with something, how you communicate that with providers and with Medicaid. Incident management, committees, groups, and transparency. What they're trying to do is create committees and groups that include people that actually receive Medicaid, which is a great idea. The measures, like I was talking about a minute ago, those measures are things to look at, and then the payments and the rates. So the biggest thing is access. We've been talking about a waiting list with Medicaid for years and years. But this is where states are required to report how long people are on that waiting list and how long people stay on the waiting list. So how many are on it, how long they've been on it on average. And the rule requires that states report every year on that length of time that people are waiting to start those services after they are actually approved. States must also report every year on the percentage of authorized hours that are provided to people for those services. Basically, what that means is if you are approved for 100 hours a year of personal care, they want to know how many of those hours were used. Was 50% used? Was 25% used? Or was it all used? That's one of the things that the states are going to be required to report is that percentage of hours that are provided or utilized. And it helps CMS identify and address those gaps between those services and that people are approved for and the ones they receive. And they probably are looking for things like, why are they not receiving all of the services? Is it because they don't want to, or is it because there's not a provider? Is it a staff shortage issue? Is it an access issue as far as, are there providers in the area? So that's kind of what CMS is wanting states to report in this access piece of the final access rule. Person-centered planning. So again, this has been talked about a lot, and what this access rule is saying is, the only change is that states must achieve 90% compliance and not 80. And what that is saying is, for people that are enrolled in these programs, you have got to do a reassessment of functional needs within 12 months. You have to revise that plan. Used to it was 80% compliant. Now it is 90. Now the state has 3 years to get there. That's what the little parentheses at the top, you know, it's giving you a deadline. And I didn't say this before, but for access for the waiting list, that was also 3 years. But for person-centered planning, there's a 3-year period that the state has to be compliant in this piece of the final access rule. Saying all this from memory, I better flip through my notes and make sure I'm getting it all. They also, let me go back 1 second. For access, the other thing I didn't say is that they have to report on screening and rescreening. So what that means is when you call the call center and you attempt to get on the waiting list for a waiver, you give them all your information. So what they also want, along with the waiting list time and average length of time people are on it, is how do they screen and rescreen eligibility? What has changed in the 5 years that you've been on the waiting list? So that's another thing that the state has got to report that. They've got to come up with a way to screen or to rescreen for eligibility. Sorry about that, guys. I missed that little piece. What happens when you don't use your notes? That's really the only other thing on the PCP is that reassessment of functional needs has to be done every 12 months, and that the state has to achieve a 90% compliance, and we have 3 years to meet that piece of it. Grievances. So for Medicaid providers, this is not just waiver providers, this is anybody. States have got to establish and manage a grievance process for people receiving HCBS in a fee-for-service system. This process gives people a way to notify their state Medicaid agency if they have a complaint about how a provider or a state is complying with person-centered planning and HCBS setting rule requirements. Face-to-face and in writing is how you can file a grievance. It has to be accessible to all. So, you know, no language barrier. You know, you've got to be able to communicate with people in the way that they communicate. That's accessible to all. Case file information provided. So you have to provide that case file for free. Like if somebody says, I have an issue with something and they want to see their file, you have to provide that for free to those people that are filing that grievance. And also in a timely manner. The way that Grayson worded this in our presentation was that you have 90 calendar days to get back to a person that's filing a grievance. The state has 2 years to be in compliance with this measure, this piece of the access rule. Incident management. This is really something the state of Alabama has been working on. I'm on one of the committees for this. So states must establish a minimum standard definition of the list of critical incidents in this regulation. States must use claims data to identify critical incidents that are unreported by providers. And I have a note about that in a second. But states will be expected to report every 24 months on the results of an incident management system assessment to demonstrate that they meet the requirements that states operate and maintain an incident management system that identifies, reports, triages, investigates, resolves, tracks, and trends critical incidents. That's a lot of words. Let me tell you what all that means. It means that we have definitions for critical incidents. Abuse, neglect, mistreatment, exploitation, med-error, hospital visits, falls, all kinds of definitions. We have pages and pages of them, right? So providers like me are supposed to report those reportable critical incidents in an online platform. It's called TheraP. And we have got to do that within a certain time frame. So what this rule is saying is that the state has got to create a way to check that things are reported. Well, how do you know things are reported when there's so many agencies in the state? They're going to pull Medicaid ER visits, was the one example that Grayson gave, to see, was that ER visit put in their app? Was that put in the IPMS reporting system? It's just probably a sample of some kind in the state, just to make sure that people are reporting things like they're supposed to. And of course, this is a way to maintain the integrity of Medicaid, right? As we are Medicaid providers, we are required to report incidents. So this is kind of their way to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to on their end of receiving Medicaid funding, which I think is completely appropriate. And I'm on the committee, on the state committee that kind of goes over some of this IPMS, or Incident Prevention Management System information. So I think this is a great one. I think that this can help with a lot of things, because when people aren't reporting things, that throws up red flags to me. So the state has 3 years to be compliant with this measure. Committees and groups. So this is new, but there is going to be a MAC and a BAC, a Medicaid Advisory Committee and a Beneficiary Advisory Committee. So those are going to be the 2 groups that they have to create, or that's a committee that they're going to create. The group is the Interested Parties Advisory Group. Basically, the BAC meets before the MAC, and a BAC should be people with lived experience with Medicaid programs, which I think is great. I think that brings a lot of transparency. It brings a lot of conversations about people that actually receive those services, and then the people that manage those services. So the groups are supposed to serve as vehicles for bi-directional feedback. So that means Mary can give feedback to the state, and the state can talk to Mary about those services. And that's how you better programs, is to involve the people that actually receive those services. But they want bi-directional feedback, so they want everybody talking to each other on matters relating to administering the Medicaid program and policy development. So I think that's really big about these committees, is it's not just what's out there now. When you talk about policy development, you're talking about fixing the system. So I think that's a great thing. This is another great piece of the access rule. That's really the only notes that I had on this, except that the Interested Parties Advisory Group can be the same group as the MAC. That's really all I have on that one. But I do think it's a great idea to involve people that actually receive those services and can give feedback. Website transparency, I think this is pretty much self-explanatory. It just means that the website must include required reporting on incident management, critical incidents, person-centered planning, service provision, compliance data, data on.
So that's basically what website transparency is it's just going to be to make sure that all the making it accessible, that information.
That makes sense. Okay.
All right, quality measure set. So this is states must report every other year on all measures in HCBS quality measures set that are identified by the United States. The HHS secretary is going to set all these measures that they want to see. So the state has to identify the subset of measures that must be stratified by race, ethnicity, tribal status, sex, age, rural, urban status, disability, language, or other factors that may be specified by the secretary. And I'm going to tell you what that means. That means everything that we're talking about has got to be able to be stratified or organized by all those pieces, by sex, by age, by are you rural or urban? Because, you know, I'm rural down here in Chatham. By disability, by language, and other factors that that secretary may place. The challenge for us is we don't already have a system that has all of that in there. So we have we have a little bit of time to become compliant with this piece. CMS indicated that states with money follow person only have a year to be compliant, and Alabama is a money follows the person state. So this is going to be a priority that the state, because you have to meet these goals, these rules for Medicaid for that, so that we've got to meet these deadlines. But this is the one that has a 1-year deadline. So just know this is something we're going to see a little bit more. That's really all I had on that, is that there's not already something that has person-centered planning, goals, Medicaid information, all those pieces, and all those measures. So they will be, the state will be trying to figure out how to plug those in to be compliant with that one. All right, then there's payments and rates. There's different deadlines on these. You'll see a payment rate transparency. That's where we have to publish on the website what the payment rates are. There's a payment rate disclosure. You'll see that it's all about 6-ish years. Well, I mean, some of them are 2 years, but the HCBS payment adequacy is in 6 years. And that's what applies to providers like me. You have to show that 80% of the service rate is spent on compensation for workers. And it's really going to the people that are providing those direct services. And that's what this one is mostly about. They're calling it like an 80-20 rule. But we already, as providers, have to disclose our wages, our DSP wages. We have to do that every quarter to the state. And there is a report that they kind of create to let us know if we are at that really good minimum average salary. So that is something else that's coming down the pipeline, is that 80% of the service rate is for compensation of the direct care staff. It's really the only thing I had on that one. And that's all. So Barry and Kim, that's that kind of just quick access. Like I said, it's a 300-page document or so, and that is the just brief little Cliff's Notes synopsis of the access rule. So
An overview.
sorry that I lost you for a minute.
It's okay. That's the internet. So what
Yes.
I want to do is take all those really big words, all those really hard to understand concepts, and try to break it down by stepping back into the HCBS settings rule for a minute and tying the two together. All right. And so I'm going to ask Mary one big trivia question. If she gets it right, we're on to the next level. And the next level is for Jessica. All right.
Okay.
We
Okay.
got this.
Got this. All right. So, Mary, I need you to tell me what all these things have in common. Lockable doors and keys, enforceable leases, control of personal resources, being able to furnish, decorate, sleep, and live in your own space as you choose, access to food, privacy, dignity and respect, freedom from coercion, freedom from restraint, access to visitors at any time, physical accessibility, person-centered planning, documentation and or of the modifications, individual initiative, autonomy, and independence measures. Setting is selected by the individual. Choice of your services, supports, and providers. And setting is integrated inside of and supports full access to the community. So you tell us, what do all of those things have in common?
I feel like it's all able to all.
Able for all.
Able for all.
Able for all. Right. Very
Yes,
good. So
ma'am.
that's a good plain language version of able for all. All are able to access the community.
Yes, all able to do whatever you set your mind to.
Wonderful. I love it. All right. So Mary's going to take that. And Jessica, if those sounded familiar to you, you tell us what rings a bell in your mind when I'm talking about those things.
The HCBS final settings rule.
Yeah, the HCBS final settings rule, which I love Mary's words. I think they're very
I do too.
appropriate.
I do
Access
too.
for all. So
I do too.
great job. And now Mary's going to throw it back to you and ask you some questions from the self-advocate's point of view. And we're going to
Okay.
do the same thing we just did and take all those really hard to understand concepts and big words and try to put it out there in the most easy to understand plain language way that we can.
Okay.
So I'm going to get off the camera and let Mary do her thing now.
So
Hey,
I'm
Mary.
gonna ask you a few questions. Are you ready?
Okay. I am.
Who needs to know about the new access rule?
I would say everybody that's enrolled in Medicaid should know about it because it provides a lot of protection and respect for their dignity, for them to know about it.
Okay, thank you so much. When did the home and community based setting rule become a thing?
So I'm gonna read back a little bit on this because this is a lot of things that I couldn't memorize. Okay, Mary?
Yes, ma'am.
But the Department of Health and Human Services, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, they had an executive order back in 2021 that established policies to protect and strengthen Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. They wanted to have high quality healthcare accessible for every American. And in 2022, they directed ways to expand availability of the coverage. Ensuring access to Medicaid services is what creates and provides this rule of access. So basically, a long story short is they've been working on it for a couple of years. I'd say about 3 or 4 years, getting this final access rule really enacted, really making sure that people have access to that those high quality services. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much because that gave me more information about it.
Mhm.
So next question is, can you tell us about why we have the access rule?
It is number one in the word that it is, it's access, right? Talking about the waiting list is about access. But also when we talk about high quality services, it's making sure that people can complain, right? The grievance. It's making sure that the services are performed correctly. Think about the incidents, like reporting critical incidents, and making sure that those quality services have DSPs and a workforce that's being compensated appropriately. So that's kind of that whole access in a whole statement.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you think the rule will make difference for people who use Medicaid waiver services?
I think that the efforts with the waiting list are definitely going to help and improve people that are trying to get waiver services and hopefully ones that have it but aren't able to use it. And by that, I mean, there are people that are already off the waiting list that don't have services yet. And that's because there's not either providers to do it or, the staff to provide that service. So this whole rule as a whole should hopefully help narrow that gap.
And help. Yeah, thank you. That how will this change things?
Getting people access to the services. Again, that waiting list, access is such a barrier depending on the places people live and the providers that are in that area, that I think that this is going to help with that actual word of access to services.
Okay. Next question is, what are some important things we should know about access to the community for people using Medicaid waiver services?
So I think one of the biggest pieces is, do you remember we were talking about access and they said they wanted the states to report the percentage
Mm-hmm.
of the authorized hours that were actually utilized? So I think that the thing that it's important to know is that that's gonna have to be reported, and that hopefully we can get a why. Why is somebody approved for 100 hours and they only used 5? And getting the answer to that, and hopefully this rule with its mandates will help again meet some of those needs for access.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. When people use waivers to get the services and support they need, do they have a legal right to those services and support?
They do. That's a great question, Mary, because when you're approved and when you get on a waiver, all the things provided on that waiver is your right. You have a right to choose that service. ADAP is a big helper with things like that to make sure that you get the services that you have the right to access. So that was a great question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. What if the person getting services and support from a Medicaid waiver is not getting what they are supposed to be getting? What should they do?
So if a person's already on the waiver, they will have a support coordinator that they can get with about those services to make sure that they are being offered all the services possible and getting those services. So that's going to be based on a provider. There are RFPs, which are requests for placement, that go out by region.
Go out by region.
And so when you're not, what was that?
You went out on us, so I filled in the blanks, but go ahead.
Thanks. So that would, if you're on a waiver, that's who I would go to about those services. If you're not on a waiver and you're on a waiting list, calling the regional office or Department of Mental Health is probably the best way to kind of figure out where you are on that list. And coming off the waiting list is about criticality. So it's about how critical is your current need. And that'll help too with coming off the waiting list and getting those services that you need.
Okay, thank you. How can
Mhm.
someone like me learn more about rights to access the community?
So the ARC of Alabama does a lot of advocacy and training with families and people in the state. There are also people in each region that can let you or family members or any self-advocate know about what's available. I would always steer towards your support coordinator. We have great support coordinators here in our area, and they're good to answer questions and help with things like that. But that would be my advice.
Okay, thank you so much. Will you share with us contact information for people who may have more questions and want to talk to an expert?
Oh, you're sweet, Mary. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I did receive training on this access rule and sat in a couple of Grayson's through some of her presentations. So I think that's why I was asked to do this, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And if I don't know the answer, I'm happy to help find the answer to those questions. So anybody that wants to can contact me.
You're so good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It gives me more information and everyone else too.
That's right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm back. That was great. Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Yeah.
So Jessica,
Mhm.
we appreciate your time. I'm gonna scoot on over to Mary and ask Mary some self-advocacy questions.
Okay.
And we can take it from here. Thank you for joining us and
You're
filling us
welcome.
in on all the latest and greatest HCBS and Access final rules. So we will see you
sounds good.
later. That was Jessica Odom with ARC.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, Kim. Bye, Mary.
Bye.
Okay, now it's your turn. You're in the hot seat.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
I know you. I've known you for quite a while.
Yes.
And I have to say, of all the advocates that I know, I think you're the cutest and most
Thank
bubbly.
you.
But you really do a good job with it. But I
Yes,
want
ma'am.
you to tell us, what does advocacy mean to you?
So advocacy means I've been an advocate for like since I was 14, probably since I was learning how to talk. I don't know. And then I didn't stop talking. And I love advocating for people. I think it's really important because I did the Awesome Mary show. I talked and how to communicate with a person with a disability and how I advocated my best advocating for people who can't talk for themselves, and everyone else has a saying or not saying, but they can talk to as not or like even if it's a device they or something they can speak up. Whatever they need to do. I talked in Montgomery about your rights and how to communicate.
Now
And
tell what's in Montgomery. What's important about Montgomery?
Montgomery is Montgomery is where the legislators are,
Mhm.
and where your legislator, which state you're in.
Mhm.
That's where you go and talk about that person and talk to what you want, what you need, and how you can achieve things.
So you've done a lot. It
Yes,
sounds
ma'am.
like. So you're basically telling us about all these wonderful things you've done on behalf of other people with disabilities who may not be able to travel to the State House in Montgomery and get up on stage and speak about it like you can.
Yes, ma'am. I don't
So-
know where I got that gift. I can't
It's
say.
a natural talent,
Yes,
but it's
ma'am.
a talent for sure.
Yes, ma'am.
So I've got kind of a redundant question for you because I probably already know the answer to it, but I just want to hear it from you. Do you like waiting?
No, ma'am. No, I do not like waiting.
Who does? Right?
No one.
Nobody
Do y'all?
likes
Do
waiting.
y'all like waiting? I don't.
Not fun. Right?
No.
So when you have to wait on something, say that
Mhm.
you're in line and you have to wait a really long time for something, or say you're on the phone and they make you hold forever to get back to you, and you're listening to that cheesy music, how does that make you feel?
That makes me feel a little impatient, and I really don't like waiting.
Frustrated?
And frustrated,
Yeah.
aggravated. Yeah, I don't like waiting.
Right there with
It's
you.
very frustrating.
Waiting is hard to do,
Mhm.
especially when you need something to happen urgently.
Yes. ma'am.
Right?
Yes,
Um,
ma'am.
Some of us are in positions where if it doesn't happen, our lives would be changed, and not necessarily in a good way,
Mhm.
in a bad way. So it becomes so important, and that waiting can become so difficult. And sometimes in the waiting, things can get worse than they were to begin with before we were waiting.
Mhm.
So if you were thinking about waiting on Medicaid waiver services, what advice would you have for people who might still be on that waiting list?
I would probably say write things down, write it down what you need, because if you just say it, it's probably not gonna happen. So you have to go, even climbing that ladder, you gotta go heel and then heel, then heel. You gotta go to the higher up person and say, especially for guidance, you need, because we're all human, we're all gonna make mistakes, but we need help once in a while, especially if you have a disability. You really need that guidance and support.
Great answer. So I think that's all of my questions for you. I'm going to add my own 2 cents at the end. After you've gone up that ladder
Yes,
and you
ma'am.
talk to the person at the highest that you
Yes,
can
ma'am.
talk to, one of my favorite advocacy questions that I just learned about at our
Mhm.
last town hall
Yes,
talk,
ma'am.
and it came from ADAP, so it's a good advocacy question, right? Is to look at that person at the top and say, oh, okay, well, I hear what you're saying. I understand you believe that's the rule. Can you show me that in writing? And then get them to show it to you in writing, because sometimes the rules have changed and the people that we're talking to may not know that the rules have changed,
Yes,
and
ma'am.
they're just telling you what they thought it used to be.
Yes, ma'am.
And so when you hear about something that doesn't make sense, doesn't sound quite right, or you think it just might be flat out wrong, it's always a good question to ask and say, can you show me that in writing? And then see what they can give you. And don't stop asking for it till you get it, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And then my second penny, every thought's worth a penny, right? The last thing I want to add is that it's really important to always remember about your natural supports around you, especially in that waiting place, and develop those relationships, not just in your community, but in your church, the church that you go to. You might have somebody who is an elder at your church.
Yes.
Who knows all about banking and finance that can give you some really great advice. You might know your neighbor down the street owns a pet care service, and they could tell you how to start your own, right? There might be somebody else in your community, say that you're in a book club and you visit somebody's house each week for a book club, and the person who's hosting that week might know everything there is to know about buying a car and saving up money for it. You might be working with somebody at your job who understands the way to get a raise or get a promotion at that place, and you could talk to them about it. So these are all really good examples of natural supports, people who are not paid to help you, but just because you asked and they happen to know about the thing you need to know about, then they can support you with some really good guidance and advice. So we call that looking out and developing relationships in the community to build social capital or natural supports. I think that's a really good advocacy point too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
You did a great job.
Thank
I'm
you.
having fun. I will
Thank
see you next time.
Yeah,
on
see ya.
Able for All.
Able for all.
Bye-bye.